That is how horror movies need to be made from now on. Welcome back, guys. This is Lonzo with Horror Movie News. Just got through watching a great movie called It's What's Inside. Now, before I get into this movie, let me just say this much, okay? If I've said it once, I've said it before. If a movie gets picked up by Sundance, if it gets picked up by South by Southwest, Cannes, or any of the other major film festivals, specifically if it's a horror movie, you need to check that movie out. 7 times out of 10, if it's a horror movie, it's going to be a good movie. Now, I'm not going to vouch for like the dramas and some of those other movies that tend to be very slow paced, but usually the horror movies, there's a good chance that those movies are good. It's What's Inside was a good movie. There was actually a bidding war for that movie. They ended up paying the most amount of money. I think it was $17 million that they ended up paying for that movie. Let me explain to you a little bit about what the story is. So the story revolves around this group of college kids that are going to this bachelor party. They all knew each other in high school, so they're coming together in college, and there's some secrets from their past, and there's some things that tie each other together. However, while they're at this party, there's a buddy named Forbes that they went to high school with that's supposed to be coming to the party. Well, he eventually shows up to the party, and with him, he brings this little machine that you can hook up to everyone's lobes, and everyone can switch bodies for an unspecified amount of time. Forbes is the only one that actually knows who gets switched into whose body, and he's the only one that can control the machine, so therein lies some of the twists and turns that the film takes. It's a very well-written movie, especially for the body-swapping genre. Some of you might think, oh, I've kind of seen and done the body-swapping things before. But the difference is a lot of the body-swapping genre stuff that's been done in the past, it's more comedic. It's more things where like a boy switches places with his dad and he's, freaks out and oh my gosh, I'm my dad and he's his son, and they got to figure out how to navigate through those worlds. There's more of the comedic spin to it. It's not necessarily done on the horror aspect, not normally. And the way that this one's done, it's done in a modern edge, and they touch on some really unique themes that we'll get into later. There are a few things I want to talk about where this movie really just did the job for me. Number one was the lighting. I felt like the lighting really brought a specific mood to the film. There was a lot of heavy use of RGB lighting, which is the red, green, blue lighting, which is like these, where they kind of use, not like this, but they used it more where it was bigger lights that were like heavily protruding in the scenes. It really set the flair and the feeling and the vibe of each scene. And even though you didn't really, unless it's something that you're really setting out to notice, like I noticed it, but a lot of people may not, it just added that extra texture to every one of the scenes that it was in that I thought was really unique. Another thing was the camera work, a lot of the camera movement. Shout out to the DP that was on this film. There was a lot of the camera movement that was really unique. Some of it was like this spinning motion that they did. So if you do get kind of sick when you see stuff like that, this may not really be the movie for you, but it's not often. But when it was used, it was like, wow, I've never seen this type of movement done in a movie before. Also the editing was really unique. And I felt like even though in another film it might come across as hokey, for whatever reason in this film, it came across as cutting edge. I really see where the director, Greg Jardin, his head was, because he was using a lot of elements that you wouldn't normally see in a horror genre. Now, that being said, this was not a horror film, not of the typical type of horror movies that you and I might watch. This was more of a thriller, psychological thriller, maybe comedic horror, but definitely not a traditional horror. There were no jump scares for me at all in this movie. There were no moments where I was like, oh, but I definitely felt like the director was on to something by putting it into that genre, because it does sort of feel like something that could be nightmarish to be caught in. So he didn't label it right, but it just doesn't have some of those traditional elements that we're used to. Okay, so the set design. The set was this old house that was almost like this modern museum, like an art museum. The mother of one of the characters was actually an artist, and so she passed away and left the son the house, and that's why he's having this wedding inside of this house. And it did feel like you were in this updated modern museum that made you feel like you were kind of trapped in this circumstance, because it was out in the country, you couldn't really go anywhere, and the house sort of became another character as well in the film, and it really helped to enhance the story. Some of the themes that were touched upon in the film were themes that were, sexuality, race, some things that would happen if you switched places with another person and jumped inside of their body. What would that feel like? You would take on their emotions, you would take on their psychological traits, you would take on their psychological deficits, you would take on their physical deficits, their physical enhancements. In some cases, a girl who was maybe decent looking went into the body of a good looking woman, and she got to experience what that felt like. A guy who was dorky got to be in the body of a guy who was this, jock and big guy. So that was a whole different feeling. However, having said that, I would say this: they could have pushed that a little bit further. A little bit farther down the road, because I felt like where they had it, you were kind of like, yeah, I can kind of get what that might be like, but you don't really get to experience in that palpable feeling way where you're watching a movie where you get to actually be inside of that character's body. You don't get to really experience what it's like to be in their physical body and experience that insecurity and that self-deprecation that happens when you view your own body. And you don't get to experience what they experience when they're in another person's body, and they really get to really talk about the downsides of what it's like being in this person's body. They didn't take that a little bit further down the edge. Now, I understand there's a little bit of a balance that the director had to play, because if you were to take it a little bit too far, people might view this as sort of a message movie. But I do think that it could have been played with a little bit more. Having said that, did it take away from the movie? No. It actually, the movie was pretty well paced. It kept you hanging on. It kept you watching. There were some moments that I felt dragged a little bit too long, and I felt like the pacing could have been adjusted a little bit in the editing room. However, it didn't take away from the overall feel and the overall joy that I experienced while watching the movie. Now, there are some twists and turns in this movie, especially in the end, so you want to definitely watch this movie, pay close attention to everything that you're seeing, and really pay close attention to the body swapping and who the characters are. I felt myself getting a little bit lost in that at times, where I was like, okay, which character is which and who's who? And they did help you out by wearing these little Polaroid pictures of who the character was, who the character is that they've now jumped into. But you kind of felt a little like, I don't really know enough about these characters to really understand who's in what body and where. So I think that's the only downside to this film, where I would say instead of giving it an A, I would maybe give it maybe a B, B+. But the storytelling, the themes, the originality, it just took this movie to a whole different level. Another thing I want to touch on is the acting. The acting in this movie is well done. There really wasn't someone that I could say stood apart from the rest. They all just were excellent at what they did. Now, you have to understand that they were playing 4 different characters. I think they switched bodies like 3 or 4 times. So they were playing the character that the other person had created. So they had to, play that character the way that person played it, and then, play a different character with the way that person played it. So it was a phenomenal job on the cast part. I think all of them did a good job as an ensemble, and it just was well acted. Having said that, there was a beginning part, and I'm not going to give away too much of the movie. Like I always tell you guys, I want you to go in fresh, so I want you to see this movie for what it is. But there was the beginning when they all first get to the house, where I could tell there was some improv happening. The dialogue was a little bit too much, and I felt like it dragged a little bit. So don't let that throw you off, because the minute that they get into the house and they really start to establish themselves, the movie floats along like butter. So that one part, I felt like it was a little excessive and it could have been trimmed a little bit, but it did help to establish some of the mindsets of some of the characters. It helped to establish some of their personalities and their character traits, so that way the audience could understand. But I felt there could have been a different way to establish those traits, and you'll see what I'm talking about once you watch the film. So I'm excited for you guys to see this movie. It's actually a really good choice on Netflix. I would say it's probably one of my top 5 horror films that I've seen on Netflix this season, if not the top 3. It's original, it's creative, it's good storytelling, good acting, and I think more horror movies need to take note of this and start seeing that originality, especially in this AI field, is going to be demanded, because these unique original ideas are going to really set the other ideas apart from the rest. So that's it, guys. If you've already seen this movie, let me know what you thought of it in the comments. Did you like it or did you not like it? Or if you watched this movie, come back, let me know what you thought. If you thought it was well-paced, if you thought it was stupid, if you thought it was actually a horror movie and it gave you a couple of scares. So until next time, guys, stay scared.